I was restoring a manor 3 states away when my neighbor Mrs. Jones called to ask why movers were emptying my house. My parents had forged my signature to sell my home and pay my brother's debts, so I initiated a legal audit they never expected. Before the story truly unfolded, the vibration of my phone against the scaffolding felt like an intrusion. I was 30 feet in the air balancing on a narrow plank, while carefully removing layers of century-old varnish from a crown molding. This was my sanctuary, the smell of sawdust, the quiet concentration, and the distance from the chaotic noise of the modern world. I was a historic home restoration specialist, a job that required patience, a steady hand, and often months spent living out of a suitcase in states far from home. I wiped a smudge of dust from my safety goggles and glanced at the screen. Mrs. Jones. My stomach gave a strange involuntary lurch because Mrs. Jones was my neighbor back in Ohio. She was a sweet but strictly private woman in her 70s who spent her days tending to her prize-winning hydrangeas. She had my number for emergencies, only such as fire, flood, or blood. In the 4 years I had lived next to her, she had called me exactly once, and that was to tell me a delivery truck had clipped my mailbox. I pulled off my heavy work glove, my fingers stiff, and swiped to answer. I asked if everything was all right, trying to keep my voice steady, despite the sudden spike in my heart rate. Alice, honey, her voice crackled over the line, thin and trembling. She said she didn't want to disturb me at work, knowing I was away, but the noise was just terrible, and she was worried about my rose bushes. I frowned, bracing myself against the wall, and asked what noise she meant since I was in Georgia and no one should be at my house. There was a pause on the other end, a silence so heavy it felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. When she spoke again, her voice dropped to a whisper. Alice, there are 2 large trucks in your driveway. The sold sign went up on the lawn 3 days ago, but I thought you knew. I saw your father letting the men in this morning, and they have been carrying out furniture for hours. The world tilted, and I actually reached out and grabbed the molding I had been sanding to keep from falling off the scaffold. Sold sign, I repeated the words, tasting like ash in my mouth. Mrs. Jones, tell me exactly what you see, I said. She told me it was a quick move reality, and that they just brought out that beautiful oak dining table I restored last Christmas. Alice, your father is standing right there with a clipboard, she said. I waved at him, but he just turned his back. My vision blurred and a cold sweat broke out on the back of my neck, instantly chilling me despite the humidity of the Georgia summer. My house, my craftsman bungalow, that I had bought as a wreck and spent 4 years lovingly restoring with my own hands, was being taken. I didn't scream and I didn't cry, but I felt a sensation I had never experienced before, a complete physical hollowing out, as if my internal organs had turned to ice. I wasn't just being robbed, I was being erased. The betrayal was worse than the diagnosis of a terminal illness, because it was a deliberate execution of my life by the people who were supposed to protect it. I descended the scaffolding with mechanical precision, my muscle memory taking over where my brain had short-circuited. I unclipped my safety harness, placed my tools in their designated slots in my kit, and walked out of the restoration site toward my rental car. My hands were shaking so badly. I dropped my keys twice before I could unlock the door. Once inside the stifling heat of the car, the reality hit me like a physical blow, and I slumped over the steering wheel, gasping for air. They sold it. They actually sold it. I grabbed my phone again and my fingers flew across the screen, dialing the number for my mother, Brenda. It rang and rang until her cheery voicemail greeting played, which felt like a slap in the face. I hung up and dialed my father, Cameron, but it went straight to voicemail 2. I dialed Jeremiah, my brother, but the line was busy, of course. I sat back, forcing myself to breathe because panic was rising in my throat like a sour, bile-filled tide. I needed information, and I needed to know how this was even possible. I was the sole owner. Moje имя было в документах. Moje имя было в ипотеке. I hadn't signed anything. I pulled up my banking app and checked my mortgage status, only to see the words payoff pending staring back at me, innocent and horrifying. Someone had initiated a closing and triggered a payoff. I dialed my parents' landline, a number they rarely used but kept for emergencies. And to my shock, my mother picked up on the second ring. Her voice was breathless and distracted, and I could hear clinking in the background like silverware being moved. Mom, I said, and the single word came out strangled. She sounded surprised but not happy, and there was a weird, frantic energy in her tone. Alice, honey, I can't talk right now. We are having a bit of a family crisis, she said. A crisis? I gripped the steering wheel so hard the leather creaked. I asked her if this crisis involved movers emptying my house in Ohio while I was in Georgia. There was absolute dead silence for a moment before she sighed. It wasn't a sigh of guilt, but the sigh of a parent dealing with a toddler who refused to eat their peas. Oh, Alice, don't be dramatic, she said, shifting into that familiar dismissive tone I had known my whole life. She claimed they didn't want to worry me while I was on my little work trip because they knew how stressed I get. Stressed, I whispered, my voice rising in pitch. Mom, Mrs. Jones says there is a sold sign on my lawn, and Dad is loading my furniture onto a truck. What have you done? We did what had to be done, she snapped, her facade finally cracking. She told me that Jeremiah was in trouble, real trouble this time, and that he needed liquidity immediately. She said they couldn't wait for me to come back and hem and haw about my space, especially since I was never there anyway, always traveling for those dusty old houses. We made an executive decision for the family, she declared. You sold my house. I said the words spacing out slow and heavy. You forged my signature. We utilized the power of attorney you signed 3 years ago when you went to Europe, she countered triumphantly. She told me that they were my parents, and they knew what was best. And frankly, it was selfish of me to hoard a 3-bedroom asset when my brother was facing legal complications. She said they would discuss the details when I got back, and that they had put my personal things in a cheap storage unit on 5th Street. Now I have to go, the notary is here for the final transfer, she said. Mom, don't you dare, I started to say, but she clicked and hung up. I stared at the phone as the screen turned black. They thought I was helpless. They thought that because I was the quiet one who worked with wood and stone instead of people, I would just accept this. They thought the power of attorney from 3 years ago, a limited document I had signed solely so they could sign for packages while I was in Italy, was their golden ticket. Но пока начальный шок начал отступать, сменившись холодной и острой ясностью, я кое-что вспомнила. I opened my glove compartment and dug through the messy stack of papers I kept with me, including registration insurance and old receipts. There at the bottom was a blue folder. Inside was a copy of the revocation letter I had filed with the county clerk 2 years ago, right after I caught Jeremiah trying to use my credit card. I had officially revoked that power of attorney, and I had sent a certified copy to my parents, which they had signed for. They had either forgotten or they simply didn't care, assuming I wouldn't have the spine to use it against them. They think I am still the daughter who just wants to please them, I said to the empty car. But they had forgotten one crucial thing. I wasn't just a restorer, I was a researcher. I knew how to find paper trails, and I knew how to bury people with them. To understand why my parents would strip mine my life to save my brother, you have to understand Jeremiah. He was 6 years younger than me, and born when my parents had started making real money. So he was always the prince of the household. He was charming and handsome, but completely incapable of taking responsibility for a single action in his life. When we were kids, if Jeremiah broke a vase, it was because I distracted him, and if he failed a test, it was because the teacher was unfair. As adults, the pattern simply became more expensive. I had worked since I was 16 and paid for my own college, building my career from the ground up, starting as a mesmerizing apprentice and working my way up to a lead specialist. My house, that bungalow on Elm Street, was the physical manifestation of my hard work. I bought it as a foreclosure with holes in the roof and mold in the basement, and for 4 years, every weekend, and every spare dollar went into it. I sanded the floors by hand until my fingerprints were gone and hunted down period-correct brass hardware because it wasn't just a house, it was my masterpiece. Jeremiah, on the other hand, had ventures. He had a crypto phase that cost my parents $20,000, a luxury sneaker resale business that ended with a lawsuit, and a DJ career that resulted in nothing but noise complaints and a wrecked van. Through it all, Brenda and Cameron enabled him. My mother, Brenda, was obsessed with appearances as the head of the church social committee and a woman who wore pearls to the grocery store. To her, family meant protecting the image, and Jeremiah's failures were cracks in that image that had to be plastered over with money. My father, Cameron, was a retired insurance adjuster who believed the world owed him something. He was loud and blustering and viewed my career as a cute hobby and my independence as a personal insult. He often joked at family dinners that I needed to find a husband so I could stop playing with hammers. But the real toxicity was their act of predation on me to sustain him. Over the years, the loans they asked for became demands, and the guilt trips became ultimatums. I sat in the rental car piecing together the timeline and realized Jeremiah must have gotten into deep water. Brenda had mentioned legal complications, which usually meant debt sharks or fraud. To bail him out, they needed a massive injection of cash, and my house sitting empty while I was away must have looked like a piggy bank waiting to be smashed open. The antagonist wasn't just the act of selling the house, but the dynamic itself. It was Jeremiah likely whining to them right now. It was Cameron feeling like the patriarch for sacrificing my assets, and it was Brenda rationalizing the crime as maternal love. I thought about the buyer mentioned on the phone and wondered who buys a house in just 3 days. I pulled up the listing online and saw it had been posted on Zillow only 4 days ago. It was listed as cash only and quick as is, with a price that was suspiciously low, at least $50,000 under market value. They were fire selling my life. Then I saw the listing agent Jeremiah Vance. Мой брат не был агентом по недвижимости, но год назад он недолго учился на лицензию, прежде чем бросить учебу. I wondered if he had faked that too, or if he was listing it for sale by owner using my identity. The level of fraud was staggering, including identity theft forgery and real estate fraud. I looked at the photo Mrs. Jones had sent again. Cameron was smiling and looking proud as he sold my favorite dining table, probably for pennies on the dollar, to clear space for the new owners. I felt the tears finally dry up, replaced by a cold, calculating rage. They wanted a restoration, so I would strip them down to the studs. I didn't storm out of the car or throw my phone. I sat there in the oppressive Georgia heat and let the cold logic of my profession take over. In restoration, when you find rot in a load-bearing beam, you don't paint over it, you expose it, brace the structure, and cut it out. My first call wasn't to the police, but to Marcus Thorne. Marcus was a real estate attorney back in Ohio, with a shark's grin and a pit bull's tenacity. I had worked with him on historical preservation easements, and I knew he was lethal. He answered on the second ring, and I told him I needed to hire him immediately on a retainer. I explained that my parents were currently attempting to close a sale on my primary residence using a power of attorney I had revoked 2 years ago. I told him movers were already on site and that the closing was imminent. The jovial tone in his voice vanished instantly when he heard the word revoked. Marcus asked if I had the filing, and I confirmed I had the stamped copy from the county clerk in my glove box. He told me to listen carefully and said if they were closing today or tomorrow, we needed to file a lis pendens immediately. He explained that this would put a cloud on the title, and no title company in America would insure the transfer if there was pending litigation. It would freeze the property dead in its tracks. He promised to have it filed electronically within the hour, but warned that if the money had already changed hands, it would get messier. I told him to do it and that I wanted a forensic accounting of the transaction, including the buyer, and exactly whose bank account that money was being wired to. I hung up and started the engine. The drive from Savannah to Ohio was 10 hours, but I did it in 9. For 9 hours, I didn't listen to music or podcasts. I drove in silence, fueling my adrenaline with caffeine and rage. As the miles blurred, I used the time to dig deeper. I had my iPad mounted on the dashboard, and while safely stopped at rest areas, I became a digital forensic investigator. I knew Jeremiah's passwords because he was lazy and used the same variation of his high school football jersey number for everything. I logged into his email first, and it was a disaster zone of spam and overdue notices. I searched for terms like contract loan and urgent, and there it was. It was not a loan from a bank, but a series of threatening emails from a user named VegasVinny77. The subject line said final notice, and the body told Jerry he was out of time and needed $80,000 by Friday, or they would contact his family. By contact, they meant a physical visit. My brother had gambled away $80,000 online. Then I found the second email chain between Jeremiah and my father. Cameron, my father, had sent an email with the subject line solved, telling Jeremiah not to worry because he and Brenda had handled it. Cameron wrote that my place was just sitting there gathering dust anyway, and that they had found a cash buyer, a flipper, who wanted a quick deal. He explicitly mentioned using the power of attorney and told Jeremiah to keep his mouth shut until the wire hit. He even wrote that they would tell me it was an eminent domain issue later because I was soft and would get over it. Soft, I repeated aloud, the words bouncing off the windshield. They didn't just steal from me, they held a strategy meeting about it. They assessed my worth as a human being and decided I was nothing more than an asset to be liquidated to save the golden child. I arrived in my town at 8 p.m. as the sun was setting and casting long bruised shadows across the streets. I turned onto Elm Street and my heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. There it was, my house. The sold sign was gone and the moving truck was gone, but the house looked wrong. The porch was empty and my rocking chairs were missing. The curtains in the front window were gone, leaving the house looking like a skull with hollow eyes. And there in the driveway sat my parents' beige sedan. I didn't park in the driveway, I parked on the street, blocking them in. I walked up the path I had laid myself and pushed the front door open. The smell hit me first. It wasn't the smell of my lavender diffusers or the old wood wax I used. It smelled of takeout food and my father's cheap cologne. The living room was half empty, my restored 1920s sofa was gone, and my bookshelves were stripped bare. My collection of architectural history books was boxed up and stacked haphazardly by the door. In the kitchen sitting around my breakfast island were Brenda, Cameron, and Jeremiah. They were eating pizza out of the box and drinking a bottle of my vintage champagne that I had been saving for my wedding day. They looked up as I stepped into the archway, and the silence that followed was absolute. Jeremiah froze with a slice of pizza halfway to his mouth, looking haggard with dark circles under his eyes, but wearing a brand new watch. Brenda was the first to recover, wiping her mouth with a napkin and putting on that fake smile she used when trying to return something she had clearly broken. She exclaimed my name and said they didn't expect me back so soon. "Sit down," I said. It wasn't a request. My voice was low, flat, and hard, like a site foreman telling a crew that someone had just been fired. Cameron stood up, his face flushing red, and blustered that I shouldn't come in giving orders since they were my parents and had stepped in to handle a crisis. "You sold my house," I said, walking further into the room. I didn't even look at Jeremiah. I kept my eyes locked on Cameron. He puffed out his chest and said they leveraged an asset because Jeremiah was in serious trouble, and they didn't have the liquidity I did. He claimed the sale had closed that afternoon, and the money was in an escrow account scheduled to wire to them tomorrow morning. Brenda waved a hand dismissively, saying my furniture was in storage, though they sold the bigger pieces to the new owner because he wanted it furnished. She told me I should be thanking them, and that I could move back in with them to save money. I looked at them and realized they weren't scared. They were just annoyed that I was ruining their celebration. They genuinely believed their authority as parents superseded the law. "You used the power of attorney," I said. Cameron defiantly confirmed it and said thank God they had it. "The power of attorney I revoked 2 years ago," I said clearly. The room went still. Cameron's eyes flickered, and he tried to claim they never received a revocation. I told him I had the certified mail receipt he signed himself on June 14th, and the stamped filing from the county clerk. I leaned my hands on the counter and told them the part they were going to hate. I had already filed a lis pendens, and the title was frozen. The wire transfer they were waiting for was never coming. Jeremiah made a noise, a high strangled whimper, as he dropped his pizza. "What? No, Alice, you can't," he cried out. "I already did," I replied. "You stupid girl," Cameron shouted, slamming his hand on the counter. "Do you have any idea what you have done? The money isn't for us, it's for Vinny." I interrupted him and said I knew it was for the $80,000 Jeremiah gambled away. Jeremiah went white, and Brenda gasped, her hand flying to her mouth, asking how I knew. I told them I knew everything about the debt, the email plans, and the felony they committed by forging my signature. I told them it was fraud and grand larceny. "We are your family," Brenda shrieked, tears suddenly springing to her eyes as she used her familiar weaponized crying. She asked how I could be so selfish when my brother's life was at stake, and said that the people he owed money to would hurt him. I replied coldly that maybe he should have thought about that before he bet 80 grand he didn't have. "Fix it," Cameron growled, stepping around the island to loom over me and use his size to intimidate me. He told me to call the lawyer and lift the lis pendens, or I would not have a family left. I looked up at him and didn't flinch. Telling him that I didn't have a family, I had thieves who broke into my house. The standoff was broken by the ringing of Jeremiah's phone. He looked at the screen and started shaking visibly. He didn't answer it. Cameron asked if it was them, and Jeremiah whispered that it was Vinny. He said Vinny wanted the confirmation number for the wire. Brenda hissed at him to tell Vinny there was a bank delay, but Jeremiah cried out that he couldn't because Vinny knew the house was the asset. He looked at me with wide, terrified eyes and begged me to let the sale go through, promising to pay me back. I told him he had never paid back a dime in his life. Brenda pleaded that this was life or death and asked if I was really going to let him get hurt over a building. It is not a building, I said. It is my life, and you didn't just sell a building, you sold my trust. But as I looked at them, I realized the trap I was in. If I held the line and Jeremiah got hurt, they would blame me forever as the villain of the family narrative. If I gave in, I lost everything. I needed to change the battlefield. I told them I would not lift the list pendants, but that I might have another solution. I asked who the buyer was. Cameron tried to say it didn't matter, but I insisted because if the buyer was a flipper, he wanted equity. But if it was one of Vinny's guys, it was money laundering. Cameron admitted the buyer was an LLC called QMR Holdings. I pulled out my phone and called Marcus again, putting him on speaker. I told him to look up QMR Holdings in the state registry immediately. Marcus grumbled about it being 9 p.m., but a moment later I heard his typing. He found it and told me the registered agent was Vincent Morty. I looked at Jeremiah and realized Vinny himself was the buyer. Jeremiah nodded, looking at the floor, and explained that Vinny said he would take the house as payment for the debt, plus another 20 grand in cash, to Jeremiah to walk away. The picture finally clicked into focus, and it was worse than I thought. They weren't just paying a debt, they were handing over a $450,000 asset to a loan shark to settle an $80,000 debt. My parents were literally giving away $350,000 of my equity because they were too panicked to do math. You absolute idiots, I breathed, telling them the house was appraised at nearly $500,000 and they sold it for almost nothing. It was the only way, Cameron shouted. I turned back to the phone and told Marcus the buyer was the loan shark, and this was a predatory lending scheme and extortion. I said if we went to the police, the sale would be void anyway as proceeds of crime. Jeremiah screamed no police, saying Vinny would kill him if the cops got involved. I told Marcus to hold on, and I muted the phone, looking at my pathetic family. They had destroyed my sanctuary and tried to rob me blind out of fear and incompetence. I told them I would not lift the freeze and the house would stay mine, but I would not call the police on Vinny yet. Brenda asked what I would do, and I said I was going to talk to Vinny myself. Cameron said he was dangerous, and I replied that so was I because I was the woman whose house he was trying to steal. And I had a lawyer and a paper trail. I told them Vinny wanted money, not a federal investigation into mortgage fraud. I demanded Jeremiah's phone, and when he hesitated, I threatened to call the cops and turn him in for forgery. He handed it over while it was still ringing. I answered the call, and a gravelly voice rasped, asking where the money was. I introduced myself as Alice, the owner of the house, and told Vincent we needed to talk. There was a pause before he told me to put Jerry on. I told him Jerry was indisposed, and the house was frozen because my lawyer had filed a lice pendens. I told him he was attempting to purchase a property via a fraudulent power of attorney, which was a RICO predicate act. I mentioned my lawyer was drafting an affidavit for the FBI, and that I knew he didn't want the feds looking at his books over a measly 80 grand. Silence followed. I had guessed right, because guys like Vinny thrive in the shadows and don't know how to handle someone who speaks the language of federal regulation. What do you want? Vinny asked, his voice dropping lower. I told him he had to walk away from the house and sign a release of the contract immediately, and in exchange I would not send the file to the FBI. He asked about the money Jerry owed him, and I told him that was between him and Jerry. But he was not getting my house. He told me Jerry had until noon tomorrow or he would lose a thumb, and then he clicked off. I handed the phone back to Jeremiah and told him he had until noon. Brenda wailed that I hadn't fixed it and had only made it worse, but I told her I saved my house. I told them they had 12 hours to figure out how to pay the debt without using my assets. I pointed to the door and told them to get out. Cameron blinked and tried to stay, but I told him to take his pizza and his champagne and get off my property. I threatened to call the police to report 3 trespassers, and reminded them that since they forged a legal document today, they really didn't want to talk to the police. I stared them down until the power dynamic shifted, and the scared little girl they once knew was replaced by a homeowner. Cameron glared but grabbed his keys while Brenda sobbed, and Jeremiah looked at me like I was a monster. "I hope you are happy," Jeremiah spat as he walked past me. "I am not," I said, "but I am home." I watched them drive away, then locked the door and slid down against it, finally letting myself cry. But they weren't tears of sadness, they were tears of relief. The next morning at 9 a.m., my phone began to buzz with calls from the extended family. My parents had told them I was acting out of spite and blocking a sale that would save Jeremiah's life. I drove to my parents' house, where a full family tribunal was gathered. I didn't sit down. I stood in the center of the room and played the recording of my call with Vinny. The color drained from their faces as they realized the truth about the loan shark and the gambling debt. My house was off the table forever, and I told my father to use his own 401k to save his son. The fallout was swift. Cameron and Brenda drained their savings and took a high-interest loan against their car titles to pay Vinny. They kept Jeremiah's thumbs, but they lost their own financial security and had to downsize their home within 6 months. My lawyer Marcus made sure the notary who helped them lost her license, and I received a settlement for all my legal fees and the cost of my missing furniture. I spent the next few months restoring my bungalow back to its original state, painting the walls a soft sage green to erase the memory of the chaos. As I stood in my garden one evening, I realized it wasn't a tragedy, but a restoration. I had stripped away the rot in my walls and in my life, and I was finally at peace.